Jake "Sparky" Reynolds had always been a mechanic, fixing broken engines, repairing starships, and keeping things together when everything else was falling apart. He worked on the Ironclad, a sturdy ship built for hauling cargo across distant systems. Life in space had always been more about survival than excitement for Jake. But today, excitement found him in the worst way possible. The Ironclad was mid-transit through the Arcus Prime system when disaster struck. Without warning, the ship's alarms blared to life. The entire vessel shook violently, throwing Jake across the maintenance bay. Sparks flew as circuits overloaded, and a loud explosion echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. "What the?" Jake gasped, scrambling to his feet. His hands flew over the control panels as he tried to figure out what was happening. This wasn't a simple malfunction. This was something far worse. As the ship groaned under the strain of another impact, Jake made his way to the cockpit. The sight that greeted him was enough to chill his bones. The Ironclad was caught in a gravitational anomaly. Some unseen force had latched onto the ship, pulling it toward the desolate surface of Arcus Prime. "Brace yourselves," the captain's voice crackled through the comms, panic evident. "We're going down." Jake barely had time to strap into a safety harness before the ship plummeted. The descent was brutal, with the Ironclad spinning wildly out of control. The planet's surface rose up to meet them, and with a deafening crash, they hit the ground. Everything went dark. When Jake regained consciousness, the smell of smoke and burning metal filled the air. The ship was wrecked, parts of it still smoldering from the impact. Outside the viewport, Arcus Prime stretched out like a wasteland, endless dunes of sand under a blood-red sky. Groaning, Jake unbuckled his harness and checked for injuries. Bruised but not broken, he stumbled to his feet and surveyed the wreckage. The crew was nowhere to be seen. Either they had been ejected in escape pods or were buried somewhere under the debris. Jake grabbed his toolkit and what little supplies he could find. If there was one thing he knew, it was that he couldn't stay here. The planet's surface was harsh, and the Ironclad was beyond repair. He needed to find help, and fast. That's when he saw it. In the distance, half buried in the sand, was another ship. It wasn't human-made. The sleek, metallic structure shimmered under the red sun, its strange curves and angles unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. Curiosity tugged at him. Whoever, or whatever, was inside that ship, it might be his only chance of getting off this planet alive. With his wrench in hand, Jake set off toward the alien craft, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. Jake trudged through the shifting sand, every step a struggle in the oppressive heat of Arcus Prime's twin suns. Sweat dripped down his face, and the weight of his tool bag seemed to double with each passing moment. But he pressed on, his eyes locked on the distant alien ship. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, smooth and sleek. Its metallic surface gleamed with a strange iridescence, casting soft hues of blue and purple across the landscape. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. The ship wasn't just damaged. It looked abandoned. One of the wings had broken off, and there were scorch marks along the hull as if it had been through a battle. A large section of the ship was buried under the sand, but the main entrance was partially open, hanging off its hinges. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't ended well for the occupants. Jake approached cautiously, gripping his wrench tighter. The eerie silence of the planet's wasteland was unsettling, only broken by the occasional whisper of wind. As he neared the entrance, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft hum, barely audible, but definitely there. Something was still functioning inside. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice trembling slightly. No response. He stepped through the broken hatch and entered the ship. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with a strange organic material that pulsed faintly with light. The air inside was cooler than outside, and for a moment, Jake was relieved to escape the planet's searing heat. His eyes adjusted to the dimness, and he could make out the remains of what appeared to be a control room ahead. Suddenly, there was movement in the shadows. Jake froze, his heart pounding. Two figures emerged from the far side of the room, their shapes humanoid but clearly not human. The first was tall, with skin the color of twilight, dark blue with faint silver markings that shimmered in the low light. The second figure was slightly shorter, with a more slender frame and skin that gleamed like polished obsidian. They stared at Jake with wide, unblinking eyes, alien eyes filled with both suspicion and fear. Neither of them moved, as if unsure whether he was friend or foe. "Hi. I'm not here to hurt you," Jake said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept his tone calm. "My ship crashed. I saw yours and thought, maybe you could help." The taller alien tilted its head slightly, as if trying to comprehend his words. They exchanged a glance, and the shorter one stepped forward, placing a hand on what looked like a control panel. A series of strange, glowing symbols flashed across the walls, followed by a sharp beeping sound. Jake held his breath, unsure of what would happen next. He could feel his pulse racing, but something told him these beings weren't hostile, at least, not yet. The taller alien, with a voice like wind through the trees, spoke something in an unfamiliar language, but Jake could only guess at its meaning. They stepped closer, their posture more curious than threatening now. The shorter one reached into a pouch at their side and produced a small device, holding it out toward Jake. He hesitated. Whatever it was, it looked like some kind of scanner. After a moment, he nodded and allowed the alien to wave the device over him. It emitted a soft whir, and the taller one seemed to study the readings with interest. Finally, the taller alien spoke again, and this time, Jake's translator kicked in. The voice was soft but firm. "You are alone." Jake exhaled, relieved that they could communicate, even if just barely. "Yeah, my crew, they're gone. It's just me." The aliens exchanged another look, this one more sympathetic. The taller one stepped back, as if considering what to do next, while the shorter one gestured for Jake to follow them deeper into the ship. As they led him through the narrow corridors, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the alien technology surrounding him. Every surface seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a strange energy. The ship was clearly damaged, with some areas completely inaccessible, but it was still operational, barely. They reached what appeared to be an infirmary. The room was filled with various medical instruments, some of which looked disturbingly unfamiliar. But what caught Jake's attention was a third figure lying on a raised platform in the center of the room. It was another alien, but this one was in much worse shape. Their skin, a deep violet, was marred with burns and strange lacerations, and their breathing was shallow. The two aliens exchanged worried glances and began working on the injured one, their hands moving swiftly over the alien's wounds with tools Jake couldn't even begin to understand. Jake felt a surge of empathy. He didn't know these creatures, but he could see their distress. This was a life-or-death situation for them. And while he wasn't a doctor, he was still a mechanic. Fixing things was what he did. "If you need help, I'm pretty good with repairs," Jake offered, not knowing if they could even use his help, but hoping they'd understand his gesture. He pointed to the equipment they were using, and then to himself. "I might be able to fix some of this." The shorter alien looked up, then at the taller one, before nodding cautiously. They handed Jake a strange tool, one that seemed to hum with a life of its own. Jake examined it, trying to figure out how it worked. It was alien, sure, but technology wasn't all that different, no matter where it came from. He set to work, his hands moving with practiced precision. The device they were using to treat the injured alien was malfunctioning, and after a few tense minutes of adjustments, he managed to get it working again. The faint hum of the equipment grew steadier, and the aliens nodded in approval. The taller one spoke again, this time with more warmth. "You have saved us." Jake smiled, feeling a strange sense of connection to these beings. "I guess we're in this together now." The tension in the air began to fade as Jake finished his repairs on the medical equipment. The tall alien, who Jake assumed was the leader, gave a slow, deliberate nod, the faintest hint of gratitude showing in their glowing violet eyes. Meanwhile, the shorter alien continued working on stabilizing their injured comrade. The room, once filled with uncertainty, now hummed with a fragile sense of cooperation. "We are not so different after all," Jake muttered to himself, watching as the strange medical devices hummed to life. Fixing things had always given him comfort, but this situation was unlike anything he'd ever imagined. The leader of the aliens stepped closer, their iridescent skin glowing softly in the low light. "Your repairs have helped us greatly," the translator in Jake's earpiece conveyed, though the alien's tone was calm and serious. "But we are still stranded here, just as you are." Jake nodded, feeling a growing sense of camaraderie. "My ship's toast. There's no way I'm getting off this planet without help. How about yours?" The alien's violet eyes flickered toward the walls of their damaged ship. "Our craft sustained critical damage upon entry to this planet's atmosphere. It will not fly again without extensive repairs, perhaps beyond our capability." "Great," Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He surveyed the wrecked control panels and the damage to the ship's hull. "So we're stuck here, unless we can figure something out." The alien leader tilted their heads slightly, considering Jake's words. "We may be able to help each other," they said, "but first we must share our story." Jake sat on a nearby console, watching as the alien began to explain. The leader introduced themselves as Zaira, and the shorter one was Eris. The injured alien on the table was Sarah, a fellow crew member. They had been on a mission of exploration, mapping uncharted worlds when their ship was ambushed by hostile forces. "Our enemies destroyed our engines and weapons systems," Zaira explained, her eyes narrowing. "We barely escaped with our lives and crash-landed here. We have been stranded for days, and Sarah was badly injured in the attack." Jake listened intently. The mention of enemies set his nerves on edge. "So we're not alone on this planet?" Zaira nodded slowly. "No, the ones who attacked us, known as the Trinkar, may still be nearby. They are ruthless, and if they find us, they will not hesitate to kill us all." The chill ran down Jake's spine. Being stranded on an alien planet was one thing, but knowing there were hostile forces out there hunting them made the situation much more dire. "What do they want?" "Technology, resources, power," Zaira replied. "They are scavengers, seeking to take whatever they can from weaker civilizations. We were lucky to escape, but they will come for us again." Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just about getting off the planet anymore. This was about survival. He looked at Zaira, then at Eris, who was still tending to Sarah's wounds. They were skilled, but they were outmatched by the Trinkar. "We need a plan," Jake said, standing up. "If those Trinkar are still out there, we can't just sit here and wait for them to find us. We need to repair your ship and get out of here. Fast." Zaira's expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "We agree, but our ship's power core is damaged beyond repair. Without it, we cannot leave this planet." Jake thought for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. "What about the core from my ship? The ironclad's reactor was intact when I left. It's not exactly the same as your tech, but maybe we can adapt it to power your ship." Zaira exchanged a glance with Eris, and then turned back to Jake. "It is a dangerous plan. The Trinkar may have already detected your crash site. If we go back there, we risk drawing their attention." Jake shrugged. "We're sitting ducks here anyway. It's risky, but it's our best shot." For the first time, Zaira's lips curved into something that resembled a smile. A small, almost imperceptible expression of agreement. "Very well, human. We will go together." Jake nodded. "All right then. Let's get ready. We'll need to move fast." He gathered his tools, stuffing them into his bag, while Eris and Zaira prepared their weapons, sleek, alien devices that hummed with energy. Zyra placed a hand on Jake's shoulder as they prepared to leave the safety of the ship. "Your bravery is commendable, Jake Reynolds," Zyra said, her voice soft but firm. "But know this, the Trincar will not hesitate to kill if they find us. Stay alert." Jake nodded. "I'll be ready." With that, the trio stepped out into the scorching heat of Arcus Prime, the vast desert stretching endlessly before them. The wreckage of the ironclad was several miles away, and every step they took was filled with a growing sense of urgency. The planet was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind across the sand. As they approached the site of Jake's crash, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something didn't feel right. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement, small, faint, but definitely there. "Zyra," Jake whispered, "we've got company." Zyra's eyes flashed with recognition. Trincar scouts. Jake's pulse quickened. There, in the distance, barely visible through the heat waves, were figures moving toward the wreck of the ironclad. They were humanoid, but their armor gleamed with a menacing black sheen, and they moved with precision and speed. "They're already here," Eris muttered, gripping their weapon tightly. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The Trincar had found them, and now it was a race against time. Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive. He knew they didn't have much time before the Trincar would overrun his crashed ship. Every second counted. "We need to move," he whispered urgently to Zyra and Eris. "If they get to my ship before we do, we'll lose any chance of salvaging the core." Zyra nodded, her violet eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. "Agreed. We must be swift, but we cannot engage them directly. The Trincar are highly trained warriors, and we are outnumbered." Jake glanced at the scouts, who were steadily advancing toward the wreckage. There were at least 5 of them, moving in tight formation, their black armor shimmering under Arcus Prime's twin suns. They didn't have much time to strategize. "What's the plan, then?" Jake asked, gripping his wrench tightly. Zyra pointed toward a rocky outcrop that overlooked the ironclad's crash site. "We will take the high ground. From there, we can observe their movements and find an opening to reach your ship. Eris and I will cover you while you extract the core." Jake frowned. "You're going to fight them, just the 2 of you?" Zyra's expression didn't waver. "We will do what is necessary. Our weapons may not match their numbers, but we can provide enough distraction for you to complete your task." Eris, who had been quiet up until now, gave a confident nod. "We'll handle them. Just be quick." Jake hesitated. This wasn't exactly how he'd imagined things going down, but there wasn't much choice. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do this." The 3 of them made their way toward the outcrop, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible. The oppressive heat of the planet bore down on them, but the adrenaline coursing through Jake's veins kept him focused. Every step brought them closer to the wreck of the ironclad, and every step increased the risk of being spotted by the Trincar. Once they reached the outcrop, Jake crouched behind a boulder and peered down at the crash site. The ironclad was a twisted heap of metal, half buried in the sand, but the reactor core, his goal, was still intact. The Trincar scouts were now dangerously close, scanning the area with sharp, calculated movements. Zyra motioned to Jake. "You go. We will engage them once you're inside the wreckage." Jake nodded, his heart pounding. He tightened his grip on his wrench and darted toward the wreck, staying as low to the ground as possible. His boots sank into the sand, slowing him down, but he pushed forward, adrenaline driving him on. When he reached the remains of the ship, he wasted no time. He slipped through a gap in the twisted metal and made his way toward the reactor room, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The core was right where he'd left it. Massive glowing cylinder that hummed softly with power. Now came the hard part, disconnecting it without blowing everything up. Jake knelt in front of the core and began working, his hands moving with practiced precision. He quickly identified the main conduits and started disengaging the safety locks. Sweat dripped down his face, and his fingers trembled slightly. One wrong move, and he'd be vaporized along with the core. Meanwhile, outside the wreck, Zyra and Eris were preparing for battle. They had taken up positions along the ridge of the outcrop, their sleek alien weapons trained on the Trinkar scouts below. Zyra gave a sharp nod to Eris, and the two of them opened fire. A volley of energy blasts erupted from their weapons, striking the ground around the Trinkar. The scouts reacted instantly, diving for cover behind the wreckage of the ironclad. Their black armor glinted in the harsh sunlight as they returned fire, energy bolts whizzing through the air with deadly precision. Zyra and Eris moved swiftly, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. They fired with calculated accuracy, forcing the Trinkar to stay pinned down. But it was clear that the scouts were well trained. They quickly adapted to the ambush, spreading out and advancing toward the outcrop with grim determination. Jake heard the battle raging outside, the sound of energy blasts and explosions echoing through the wreckage. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay focused on the task at hand. He carefully disconnected the final conduit and lifted the core from its housing. It was heavy, far heavier than he'd expected, but he managed to hoist it onto his shoulder. Almost there, he muttered to himself, stumbling slightly under the weight of the core. He made his way back through the wreckage, gritting his teeth against the strain. Outside, the battle was intensifying. The Trinkar scouts were closing in on Zyra and Eris, their blasters lighting up the desert with bursts of energy. As Jake emerged from the wreck, he saw Zyra and Eris in a fierce firefight. Zyra's precision was unmatched, her shots landing with deadly accuracy, while Eris moved with lightning speed, dodging incoming fire and retaliating with blasts of their own. But the Trinkar were relentless. One of them managed to flank Zyra, sending a barrage of shots toward her position. She narrowly avoided the blasts, but the close call left her momentarily exposed. Jake's heart leaped into his throat. "Zyra, look out!" Before he could act, Eris dashed forward, tackling the scout and knocking their weapon aside. Brief but brutal struggle ensued, with Eris managing to disarm the Trinkar and deliver a devastating blow to their head. The scout collapsed in the sand, unmoving. Zyra nodded in gratitude to Eris, but there was no time to celebrate. The remaining scouts were closing in fast, and the situation was growing more dangerous by the second. Jake knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "I've got the core," he shouted, running toward them. "We need to get out of here." Zyra and Eris fell back toward Jake's position, firing as they went. The Trinkar scouts pursued, their weapons blazing, but the trio managed to reach cover behind the wreckage of the ironclad. "We can't keep this up," Eris panted, glancing at Zyra. "We're outgunned." Zyra nodded, her expression grim. "Then we must retreat. We have the core. Let's go." Jake didn't need to be told twice. With the heavy reactor core weighing him down, he followed Zyra and Eris as they made a break for it, racing across the dunes toward their own ship. The Trinkar scouts gave chase, but the trio moved with desperate speed, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on it. As they ran, Jake could hear the distant roar of engines. More Trinkar reinforcements, no doubt, but they were close now, close to the safety of the alien ship. If they could just hold out a little longer. The entrance to the ship loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. Zyra and Eris rushed inside, covering Jake as he staggered in with the core. The moment they were inside, Zyra slammed the hatch shut. "We made it," Jake gasped, collapsing onto the floor, the reactor core rolling beside him. "Now, let's get this thing installed and get out of here." Inside the alien ship, Jake collapsed onto the cold floor, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The heavy reactor core lay beside him, the faint hum of its energy filling the enclosed space. He could still hear the distant roar of Trinkar engines outside, getting closer. They had made it to the ship, but time was running out. Zyra wasted no time. "We need to install the core immediately." she said, her voice steady but urgent. Harris, help Jake. We must power up the ship before the Trincar reinforcements arrive. Jake nodded, pulling himself to his feet despite his body's protests. He had worked on plenty of human-made ships in his time, but this alien vessel was something else entirely. The technology was advanced, the systems unfamiliar, but at its core, pun intended, technology was still technology. He could figure it out. Harris assisted him, guiding him toward the ship's power chamber. The room was bathed in a strange blue light, with holographic controls floating in the air. The power grid was complex, but Jake could see where the core needed to go. He just had to make sure it fit, and that it didn't blow up the entire ship in the process. This is going to be tricky, Jake muttered as he examined the core's housing. Your ship's system is way more advanced than what I'm used to, but I think I can adapt my reactor. Harris looked at him, their eyes filled with quiet intensity. You have no choice. We must succeed, or we will all perish. Jake swallowed hard and set to work, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. He began making adjustments to the core's connectors, rerouting power lines and bypassing damaged circuits. The alien ship's systems flickered and hummed in response, the ship coming alive bit by bit. Zyra entered the chamber, her face tense. The Trincar are closing in. They will breach the perimeter in minutes. Jake cursed under his breath. I'm working as fast as I can. Just hold them off a little longer. Zyra nodded and hurried back to the command center, where she and Eris prepared the ship for launch. Jake's heart raced as he made the final adjustments to the core. His hands trembled slightly. This was the kind of high-stakes situation he had always dreaded, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake now. With a deep breath, he locked the core into place and activated the power sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship's systems roared to life, the lights brightening as the power core pulsed with energy. We've got power, Jake shouted over the hum of the reactor. Zyra's voice came through the comms. Good. Get to the bridge. We're launching now. Jake grabbed his tools and sprinted toward the bridge. As he entered the room, he could see the ship's systems booting up. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing the exterior of the ship and the approaching Trincar forces. They were dangerously close, their dark, menacing ships hovering over the dunes like predatory birds. We need to lift off now, Zyra barked, her hands flying over the control panel. Harris was already at their station, preparing the ship for takeoff. Jake watched as the engines began to power up, the hum of energy growing louder. The ship shuddered as it lifted off the ground, sand swirling in clouds beneath them. But just as they began to ascend, a violent jolt rocked the entire vessel. Trincar ships are firing on us, Harris shouted, their eyes wide with alarm. Shields are holding, but not for long. Jake's heart pounded. He rushed to the nearest console, scanning the systems for anything that could help. The Trincar ships were relentless, bombarding them with energy blasts that sent shockwaves through the hull. The shields were flickering, failing. We won't survive this if we don't get out of here now, Jake yelled. Zyra's jaw clenched, her fingers flying over the controls, engaging full thrust. The ship lurched forward, the engines roaring as they accelerated into the atmosphere. Outside the view screen, Jake could see the Trincar ships giving chase, their weapons lighting up the sky with deadly blasts. The alien vessel dodged and weaved through the onslaught, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Harris, divert all power to the engines, Zyra commanded. We must outrun them. Harris complied, their hands moving with precision as they rerouted energy from non-essential systems. The ship surged forward, but the Trincar weren't letting up. Jake watched in horror as one of the enemy ships lined up for a direct hit. Brace yourselves, Zyra shouted. The impact was brutal. An energy blast struck the ship's rear, sending it spiraling out of control. Alarms blared as the hull groaned under the strain. Jake was thrown against the wall, the force of the blast knocking the air from his lungs. The ship plummeted back toward the planet's surface, spinning wildly. "Stabilizers are offline," Harris shouted over the chaos. Zyra's face was pale, but her resolve never wavered. "We're not going down without a fight," she growled. "Jake, can you reroute power to the stabilizers manually?" Jake pulled himself to his feet, wincing from the impact. "I'll try." He stumbled toward the maintenance hatch, his hands shaking as he pried it open. The ship was spinning violently, making it nearly impossible to stay upright. He had to hold on to the walls to keep from being thrown across the room. With a grunt of effort, he crawled into the narrow maintenance shaft and began working on the power lines. The ship continued its freefall, the planet's surface rushing up to meet them. Jake's vision blurred as he worked frantically, pulling wires and reconnecting circuits. He could hear the faint voices of Zyra and Eris shouting commands, but the noise of the ship's systems was deafening. Finally, with a spark and a jolt, the stabilizers came back online. The ship's violent spinning slowed, and Jake could feel the vessel regaining control. "I've got it," Jake shouted, crawling out of the maintenance shaft. Zyra didn't hesitate. She pulled the ship up from its nosedive, the engines screaming as they fought against gravity. The desert below loomed dangerously close, but with a final burst of speed, the ship cleared the surface, shooting back up into the atmosphere. The Trinkar ships were still in pursuit, but now they had the advantage. The alien vessel soared through the sky, its engines at full power. Jake stumbled back to the bridge, his heart still racing. "We're not out of the woods yet," Zyra said grimly, "but we have a chance now." Jake collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily. "That's all we need." As the ship rocketed through the sky, leaving the Trinkar and Arcus Prime behind, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They had made it, barely, but they had survived. Now, the real question was, what came next? As the alien ship ascended into the vast emptiness of space, the tension on the bridge eased, but only slightly. The threat of the Trinkar still loomed large, their ships relentless in pursuit. Jake could feel the ship straining under the stress of maintaining its high speed, the engines whining as they pushed the vessel to its limits. "We've bought ourselves some time," Zyra said, her eyes fixed on the navigational display. "But we can't outrun them forever. We need a new plan." Jake glanced at the damage reports flashing across the ship's console. The shields were holding, but only barely, and the hull had sustained significant damage in the attack. If the Trinkar kept up their assault, it was only a matter of time before they caught up. "What about your weapons systems?" Jake asked, looking to Zyra. "Can't we fight back?" Zyra shook her head. "Our weapons were damaged in the initial crash. We have no offensive capabilities. That's why we've been relying on speed and maneuverability to escape." Jake's mind raced. "We need to find a way to slow them down. If we can't fight, maybe we can disable their ships, at least long enough to make a clean getaway." Harris turned to Jake, their expression thoughtful. "You're suggesting we create some sort of distraction?" Jake nodded. "Exactly. But we'll need something big, something that'll make them think twice before following us." Zyra frowned. "What are you proposing?" Jake's eyes flicked to the reactor core he had just installed. "The core we salvaged from the ironclad. It's not a perfect fit for your ship. It's powerful, but unstable. If we overload it, we could generate an energy pulse strong enough to disable their systems, at least temporarily." Harris raised an eyebrow. "You want to overload the core? That's risky. If we miscalculate, we could destroy our own ship in the process." Jake nodded grimly. "I know, but if we don't do something, the Trinkar will catch us, and then it won't matter what condition our ship is in. It's a gamble, but it might be the only one we've got." Zyra considered Jake's words carefully. Time was running out, and the Trinkar were closing in fast. Finally, she gave a sharp nod. "Do it. We'll prepare for the pulse. Harris, get ready to divert all non-essential power to the shields. We'll need them to survive the blast." Jake didn't waste a moment. He sprinted back to the power core, his mind laser-focused on the task at hand. He began recalibrating the core, adjusting the energy flow to build up a massive charge. The ship's systems groaned in protest as the reactor's power levels surged. Back on the bridge, Zyra and Eris monitored the approaching Trinkar ships. The enemy vessels were closing in, their weapons primed and ready to fire. They had no idea what was coming. "The core is overloading," Jake called out over the comms. "We've got about 30 seconds before it blows. Get ready." Zyra's hands flew over the controls as she initiated evasive maneuvers, steering the ship into a tighter formation. "Eris, divert all power to the shields. We'll only have one shot at this." Eris nodded, their hands steady as they rerouted power from every system they could spare. The ship's engines whined, the lights dimming slightly as the energy was funneled into the shields. Jake watched the reactor's energy levels spike, the core glowing brighter with each passing second. The pressure was building, almost at its breaking point. 10 seconds, Jake shouted. The Trinkar ships were within range now, their weapons locked onto Zyra's vessel. They fired in unison, sending a barrage of energy blasts toward them. "Now, Jake," Zyra yelled. With a final twist of the control valve, Jake unleashed the overloaded reactor. Deafening roar filled the ship as the core discharged its massive energy pulse. The ship rocked violently, and Jake was thrown against the wall, the force of the blast knocking the wind from his lungs. Outside, the pulse expanded in a brilliant flash of light, rippling through space like a shockwave. The Trinkar ships, caught in the blast, shuddered as their systems short-circuited. Their engines sputtered, and one by one, the enemy ships drifted to a halt, their weapons disabled. On the bridge, Zyra and Eris watched in awe as the Trinkar fleet was rendered powerless. "It worked," Eris breathed, their voice filled with astonishment. Zyra let out a slow, relieved breath. "We're clear for now." Jake staggered back to the bridge, his head spinning from the force of the pulse. He leaned against the wall, exhausted but grinning. "I can't believe that actually worked." Zyra smiled, a rare expression of warmth crossing her otherwise stoic face. "You've saved us, Jake." Then, Eris nodded in agreement. "Your quick thinking has spared us from certain death." Jake waved off their praise, still catching his breath. "We're not out of this yet. That pulse bought us some time, but it won't be long before the Trinkar recover. We need to get as far away from here as possible." Zyra nodded, her expression turning serious once more. "Agreed. Let's find a safe haven where we can make full repairs and plan our next move." The ship surged forward, its engines now operating at full capacity. The stars stretched out before them as they left the disabled Trinkar ships far behind, disappearing into the vast unknown of space. For the first time since crashing on Arcus Prime, Jake allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. The immediate danger had passed, but the weight of survival still hung over them. The galaxy was a vast and unpredictable place, and while they had escaped the Trinkar for now, Jake knew it wouldn't be long before new challenges emerged. Zyra adjusted the ship's course, setting a path for the outer fringes of the system. "We'll head to a nearby uninhabited moon," she said, glancing at Jake and Eris. "It will give us time to regroup and make the necessary repairs." Eris nodded. "We'll need to be cautious. The Trinkar will be looking for us." Jake leaned back in his seat, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. "I've never been this far from home," he admitted quietly. "Never thought I'd end up out here, with aliens." Zyra smiled faintly. "The galaxy has a way of pulling people together in unexpected ways. We are all travelers, trying to survive in a universe that is often hostile." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, no kidding. Just hope we can stay one step ahead of those Trinkar." Eris glanced at Jake, their eyes filled with curiosity. "You are resourceful, Jake Reynolds. It is rare to find such adaptability among your kind." Jake smirked. I guess being a mechanic pays off in more ways than one. As the ship drifted through space, a quiet calm settled over the crew. For the first time in days, they weren't running or fighting for their lives. It felt strange, almost surreal. But Jake knew it wouldn't last forever. The galaxy was vast and full of unknown dangers. Their journey was far from over. Zyra's voice broke the silence. You know, Jake, we may have started as strangers from different worlds, but in this fight, we've become allies. Perhaps even more than that. Jake looked at her surprised. More than that? She nodded. You saved us when you didn't have to. You fought alongside us, even when the odds were against you. That's more than just survival. That's something deeper. Jake smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Well, I guess we're in this together now, aren't we? Zyra smiled back, and Eris gave a small nod of approval. The stars stretched out before them, an endless sea of possibilities. They didn't know what the future held, whether more enemies would come, or if they would find a way home. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The journey continued,